Imagine being born into a world where your first breath might also be your last, where half the children around you would never see their 10th birthday, where childhood as we know it simply didn't exist. Welcome to medieval Europe, where being a child was, without question, one of the most dangerous things you could be. The moment a medieval baby entered the world, the clock was already ticking. Infant mortality rates in medieval Europe were staggering. Historians estimate that anywhere between 20 to 30% of children died within their very first year of life. And that number only climbed higher in poorer households, in times of famine, or during outbreaks of disease. A mother who had given birth 5 times could expect, on average, to bury at least 2 of those children before they reached adulthood. That was not a tragedy. That was simply life. For those who did survive birth, the first few years were still treacherous. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no sterile environments. A simple fever could kill. A chest infection could turn fatal within days. Diarrhea, something we consider a minor inconvenience today, was a death sentence for thousands of medieval infants every single year. Parents loved their children deeply, despite what some historians once believed. But they also learned not to grow too attached too quickly, because loss was not a possibility, it was a probability. Baptism was performed almost immediately after birth, sometimes within hours. This was not just a religious custom, it was survival instinct. If a baby died unbaptized, the church taught that its soul could not enter heaven. It would be condemned to limbo, a place neither of punishment nor of peace. So no matter how weak the baby, no matter how difficult the weather, a priest was called and the child was baptized as fast as humanly possible. The soul had to be secured before the body gave out. Swaddling was the next order of business. Medieval parents tightly wrapped their newborns in long strips of cloth, binding their arms and legs completely against their bodies. To modern eyes, this looks like torture, but to a medieval parent, swaddling was protection. It kept the baby warm. It prevented the child from scratching its own face or startling itself awake. It kept the limbs straight because crooked limbs were feared and associated with deformity. Babies spent most of their first months tightly bound, hung on hooks on the wall, or placed near the fire while their mothers worked. They had no choice. Survival required labor, and labor left little time for cradling infants all day. Breastfeeding was the primary source of nutrition, and it was taken seriously. Medical writings of the time recommended mothers breastfeed for up to 2 years. But wealthier families had a different solution: wet nurses. Women who were paid to breastfeed the children of nobles and merchants. This was considered a perfectly respectable profession. A good wet nurse was highly sought after. She had to be healthy, calm in temperament, and producing strong milk. The belief was that a baby absorbed not just nutrition, but personality through breast milk. So the wet nurse's character mattered enormously. For peasant children who survived infancy, childhood did not last long. From the age of 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute to the household. Not tomorrow, not when they were ready. Now. Small children scared birds away from crops, gathered firewood, fetched water, fed animals, and ran errands. Their tiny hands were useful, nimble enough to do things adults could not. And in a world where every pair of hands meant the difference between eating and starving, no one was exempt. Not even a 6-year-old. By the age of 7, something significant happened. In medieval understanding, 7 was the age of reason. The point at which a child was considered capable of understanding right from wrong, capable of sin, and therefore capable of responsibility. After 7, boys from noble families might be sent to serve in another lord's household as a page, the first step in the long road toward becoming a knight. Boys from merchant families began apprenticeships, learning trades that would define the rest of their lives, and girls, regardless of class, began learning the skills that would make them valuable wives. Spinning, weaving, cooking, managing a household. Play did exist. Medieval children were still children. Archaeologists have found toys, wooden dolls, small carved animals, spinning tops, marbles. Illustrations from medieval manuscripts show children playing games that look remarkably familiar. Blind man's bluff, leapfrog, ball games in open fields. Even in the hardest of lives, children found moments to be children. But those moments were brief and they ended early. Education depended entirely on who your father was. The sons of nobles and wealthy merchants might attend cathedral schools or, later in the medieval period, early universities. They learned Latin, theology, philosophy, and law. These were the men who would run the church, govern the land, and shape the future. For the vast majority of children, however, the peasant children, the village children, the children of laborers, formal education simply did not exist. They learned from their parents. They learned by watching, by doing, by failing and trying again. They learned to farm, to bake, to build, to survive. The Black Death changed everything. When the plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, children were among its most vulnerable victims. Entire villages were wiped out. Some children survived only to find themselves orphaned, wandering through a landscape of death with no one left to care for them. The trauma of that generation cannot be overstated. An entire civilization lost almost a third of its population in just a few years, and the children who lived through it carried those scars for the rest of their lives. Noble children lived differently, but not necessarily better. They were dressed as miniature adults almost from the moment they could walk. Portraits of noble children show them in full adult clothing, tiny versions of their parents, complete with elaborate headdresses and heavy fabrics. They were groomed for duty from the cradle. A noble daughter could be betrothed, formally promised in marriage, before she could even read. By 12 or 13, she might already be a wife. By 14, a mother. Her childhood was not hers to keep. It belonged to her family's political ambitions. Boys of the nobility trained for war from an early age. Mock battles, sword drills, riding lessons. These began as games but quickly became deadly serious. A knight who could not fight was a knight who could not survive. The training was brutal by any standard. Falls from horses, bruises from wooden swords, hours of physical conditioning in heavy armor. Boys learned to push through pain, to ignore weakness, to see discomfort as a test of character. Because one day, and it might come sooner than expected, they would face real swords and real arrows on a real battlefield. Death was not hidden from medieval children. It could not be. They saw animals slaughtered. They attended funerals. They watched siblings die. They sometimes watched parents die. Death was woven into the fabric of daily life in a way that modern children are almost entirely sheltered from. Medieval children understood impermanence in a way that most adults today never will. They had to, because the world they lived in gave them no other choice. And yet they endured. They played despite the hardship. They laughed despite the grief. They grew up, those who were lucky enough to grow up, and they built cathedrals and kingdoms and families of their own. Medieval childhood was brutal, short, and unforgiving, but the children who survived it were shaped into something extraordinary. People who understood the fragility of life and chose to live it fully anyway. Because in medieval Europe, surviving childhood was not the beginning of life. It was already the greatest achievement of it.